Mrs. Spriles, Murder in Paradise Hills. By Amber Street. Copyright 2021. Series description: Mrs. Ellen Spriles wanted desperately to go on vacation. The summer heat was unbearable. On the spur of the moment, Ellen decided to go on a little vacation with a friend to Paradise Hills for a week. She should have known that she would end up solving yet another mystery. Episode 1, The Invitation. Mrs. Ellen Spriles of Granada Hills, California, rocked gently forward and back in her back porch rocking chair. It was the middle of June. The days were very hot, but the nights were cooler. There was a soft evening breeze that had just joined her, and it was a welcome companion. But Ellen was still overly warm from the day and fanned herself with a lovely floral paper fan as though she were swatting away flies. Ellen was 60 years old with grey hair and brown eyes. She was single, but periodically went on outings with her good friend Albert Conrad and spent time with him several times a month. He was 63 years old, with grey hair and blue eyes. Ellen and Albert had just spent the day together sipping lemonade while they ate tuna salad sandwiches and talked about things that mattered. The day had been enjoyable as always, except for one thing. They had one little disagreement while discussing a case that Ellen had solved 2 years previously. Albert thought that Ellen had missed something very important in solving the case. Ellen had believed that there was only one suspect, while Albert felt that there were 2 suspects. Only one had been arrested. Ellen took a deep breath and thought back on their conversation as she looked out at the roses in her backyard and at the well-manicured lawn. Albert's words echoed through her mind. "It was funny business, I always say." Albert's tone was intense. "I feel that the girlfriend was involved. The police would have discovered that, I would think." Ellen sipped her lemonade, which she had made a little too tart, and made a sour-faced expression. "And besides, she said that she was at the salon at the time of the murder. The only person that vouched for her being at the salon was her best friend Gertrude, who cut her hair. No one else remembers seeing her there." Ellen sighed as she came back to the present moment. "What if I missed something? That would mean that Clara Barnes had gotten away with murder." Ellen leaned back in her rocking chair. She looked at the sky. A single black crow flew by. Ellen wasn't superstitious, but every now and then she was sure that something was a bad omen. Just as Ellen was deep in thought, remembering back to the very moment that Clara Barnes had given her a certain look as her boyfriend Scott was being taken into police custody, the phone rang. "Now, who could that be?" Ellen asked out loud. She got up out of her rocking chair, which wasn't as easy as it used to be, went into the house, and answered the phone that was on the wall in the kitchen. The soft butter-yellow-colored phone was of the old-fashioned kind, and the cord quite often got tangled up and annoyed Ellen. "Hello?" Ellen said a little too gruffly into the phone receiver as she attempted to untangle the coiled cord with one hand while holding the phone to her ear with the other. "Well, hello to you, too. Is that how you answer the phone when it's your best guy calling?" Albert asked, half joking. "Oh, Albert, I'm so sorry. It's this phone. The cord keeps getting tangled up. And I was just sitting outside on the back porch thinking about that case that we were discussing earlier today. The salon murders. I had just recalled the way that Clara Barnes had looked at me when they were arresting Scott for the murder of Harrison Jennings." Ellen took a quick breath and sighed heavily. "I think that you may be right." Episode 2. Paradise Hills. "Of course, I'm right," Albert said casually before he cleared his throat. "Now, the reason that I called was to invite you to go on a little vacation with me for a week to Paradise Hills, starting tomorrow." Albert sat back in his favorite big navy blue easy chair that was in his den, in front of the fireplace, and waited for Ellen's response. He looked at the wall to the left of the fireplace. He had built a floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookcase in his younger days that had stood the test of time. It gave him much pleasure to look at his handiwork and all of the old, rare, and special books that the large bookcase held, that he had collected over the years. Paradise Hills. Is that the quaint man-made escape in Oceanside? The one with the exotic gardens and waterfalls and fancy hotels and shops? Ellen asked with piqued interest. "Yes. I scored 2 beautiful suites at the Gregario Hotel facing the falls. There's one for each of us." Ellen almost dropped the phone as she smiled because she was very expressive with her hands when something big happened, and she subconsciously started to clasp her hands together. Ellen caught the phone just as it was slipping out of her left hand. "Oh, I'm sorry. I almost dropped the phone." "Of course, I'd love to go," Ellen said with joy. "Terrific," Albert said. "I will pick you up in the morning, around 9. "Perfect. I will see you then," Ellen said with a smile before attempting to hang up the phone. Somehow, her right wrist had become entangled in the cord. Ellen fought with the cord for a moment and managed to untangle it halfway while freeing her hand and wrist from the tangled mess. The Gregario Hotel was a magnificent, grand hotel that was in the best part of Paradise Hills in Oceanside, California. It took Albert and Ellen just over 2 hours to get there from Ellen's home. Ellen had never been to Paradise Hills, although she had heard of it in passing conversations over tea with friends from her knitting club. The Gregario Hotel was 10 stories tall with a penthouse suite on the top floor. The back of the hotel overlooked beautiful man-made falls, and the front of the hotel had a magnificent view of the Pacific Ocean. The hotel was white with terracotta accents and looked very Mediterranean. Albert gave the keys to his luxurious black 4-door sedan to the valet, and then a porter took their luggage out of the trunk and brought it to their rooms while Albert checked them in. Albert and Ellen quickly freshened up in their rooms, which were amazing. The suites were adjoining and had 2 king-sized beds with beautiful and calming tropical bedspreads that matched the wallpaper that was on 2 walls. The rest of the walls were painted a soothing shade of mocha. The suites were spacious and each one had a small kitchenette, supplied with a coffee pot, free coffee, a large bowl of fruit on the counter, and various snacks in the cupboards. To the left of the kitchenette sink in the corner, there was a medium-sized red microwave. There were plenty of cups, utensils, coffee creamers, paper towels, and napkins. There were several different brands of sodas in the medium-sized refrigerators that were against the back wall of the kitchenettes. The furniture in the rooms was walnut and included a large dresser and 3 nightstands. There was a large screen TV with all the free channels that one could ask for that was attached to the wall above the dresser. Each room also had a summer grass green sofa, 2 matching chairs, a mahogany coffee table, and 2 small round tables with brass lamps. The overhead lighting was soft and had brass accents. Episode 3. Tony Pico. Once Ellen and Albert had rested a few minutes, unpacked, and freshened up, they headed back downstairs to the fancy restaurant in the back of the hotel. The hostess seated them immediately on the back patio, where they had the best view of one of the smaller waterfalls. Ellen loved the sound that the waterfall made as it hit the rocks below, and the sweet and fresh smell of the variety of flowers, including birds of paradise, which surrounded the area where the water pooled at the bottom. The hostess handed Ellen and Albert 2 very large blue lunch menus. "Your server will be right with you for your drink order." The hostess had blonde hair and blue eyes and was in her mid to late 20s. She was wearing black pants, a white button-up dress shirt, and comfortable black shoes. Her name was Cindy. Ellen was wearing her best day dress, a royal blue silk dress that leaned on the conservative side, and dark blue flats. She had her hair up in a bun. Ellen had a habit of rearranging the silverware on the table when she sat down, and today was no exception. Albert enjoyed this funny little habit of Ellen's and watched her with a smile on his face. Ellen had a way of making Albert feel young again. Albert was wearing his best vacation suit, a white casual suit with a white button-up dress shirt. The top 2 buttons were unbuttoned. And to finish his outfit, Albert wore a casual yet sporty pair of white shoes that to most people would be dress shoes. Their server approached their table with a big smile. She had dark brown hair and blue eyes and was in her early 40s. Her name was Brenda. She was wearing black dress pants, a white dress shirt, a server's black apron, and black tennis shoes. "Hi, I'm Brenda, and I will be your server today. Can I get you something to drink? Something from the bar, maybe?" Brenda looked at Ellen and Albert and smiled and waited for a response. "I'd like a sherry, please." "And a glass of water," Ellen said as she put her menu down on the table. Brenda nodded and made a note on her server's check and then looked at Albert. "It's a little early in the day, But since we are on vacation, I think that I will have a scotch on the rocks. Albert leaned forward. And a glass of water. Brenda nodded again. I will be right back with your drinks. Brenda smiled and then walked away. Ellen smiled. This is most pleasant, don't you think? She looked around at the beautiful scenery. I'm very grateful that you invited me here. I think that we are going to have a lovely time. There are a lot of fun things to do here as well. Albert smiled widely. My friend Tony Pico said that the rooms that he got for us were nice. I think that is a big understatement. Ellen smiled and said, I agree about the understatement. The suites are magnificent. And wonderful about the fun things to do. I'm looking forward to it. Ellen smiled. I would also like to visit the shops that are close by while we are here. Ellen paused for a moment and then added, Tony Pico. I don't believe that you mentioned him before. How do you know him? I met Tony about 4 years ago at a poker game. Nice fellow. We haven't seen much of each other, but he keeps in touch. I was pleasantly surprised when he called me and told me that he had to cancel his plans here and offered me his suites for free. Ellen smiled cordially and nodded. Within a moment, she got a look in her eyes. She leaned forward and whispered, Is Tony by chance related to the Pico mob family? Episode 4. Suspect. Albert gave Ellen a casual look and said in an even more casual manner, I believe that he is. Ellen got a sour look on her face and then looked around the patio. She shrugged off the fact that she and Albert were just given 2 very pricey suites by someone in the mafia, and she focused on looking at the scenery and the people that were sitting around them. She had a pleasant smile on her face. Observing people was something that she enjoyed doing when out and about or while having lunch with Albert. Ellen's expression suddenly turned sour again. You're never going to believe who is sitting on the other side of the patio, Ellen said with an annoyed look on her face. Who? Albert asked as he looked around. Clara Barnes. Ellen answered in a dark tone of voice. Albert got a look of surprise on his face and said, You're joking, even though he knew that Ellen never joked about things like that. I'm afraid not. She is at the small table next to the railing and that giant elephant plant in the large red pot. She is sitting across from a blonde-haired, blue-eyed gentleman in a dark grey suit with a red tie. He looks to be the same age as she is. Ellen leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Albert nodded his head and casually glanced over in their direction. Sure enough, it was Clara Barnes. Clara was 30 years old and had shoulder-length blonde hair and dark blue eyes. She was wearing a red dress. Albert observed her for a moment and then looked at Ellen with a serious expression. It certainly is her. I wonder who that chap is with her? A new boyfriend or a new victim, I would think, Albert said ruefully. Ellen nodded her head. Most likely both. The more that I think about what you said and the circumstances of Harrison's death, I think that Clara is quite suspect. Ellen uncrossed her arms and looked into Albert's eyes. You know, I somehow doubt that Scott was her first accomplice. I have a feeling that she finds gullible men to do her dirty work and then finds a way to get rid of them when she is done with them. In Scott's case, it was a life sentence in prison. Albert looked over at Clara and then at Ellen. You think that Clara talked Scott into killing Harrison? Albert made a face. If it turns out that Clara and that man are staying at this hotel and not simply having lunch here, I don't mean to spoil our stay here by saying this, but we should keep an eye on them. Ellen looked down at her silverware and rearranged her forks. I agree. Especially Clara. Ellen had hoped for a pleasant stay that did not include getting caught up in another mystery and was disappointed that it was not going to be the case for their leisurely week in Paradise Hills. Brenda walked up to the table with their drinks and broke Ellen's train of thought. Here are your drinks. Are you ready to order? She asked. Albert looked at Brenda. We haven't really had a chance to look at the menus yet. Albert looked at Ellen. Do you know what you want? He asked. Ellen shook her head and then looked at Brenda. Maybe just a few more minutes, if you don't mind. I'd be happy to come back in a few minutes. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, Ellen said. Brenda left. Albert took a sip of his scotch while Ellen took a sip of her sherry. Albert was the first to speak. Episode 5. Shocking news. Tony said that they have the best porterhouse steaks here. I think that I am going to give that a try. Albert glanced at the menu and then over at Ellen. He had a pleasant smile on his face. Albert was very easygoing and loved spending time with Ellen. She was fun to be with. Albert set his menu down on the table. Ellen snapped her menu shut and then set it down on the table. That sounds good to me, she said with a smile. Ellen and Albert watched Clara for a few minutes until Brenda came back for their order. Clara was holding hands across the table with the blonde gentleman and smiling at him. Brenda smiled at Albert and Ellen. She had noticed that they were looking over in the direction of Clara and the man that she was with. Beautiful couple, aren't they? I love that red dress that she is wearing, Brenda said in a monotone tone of voice, more out of politeness than true admiration. Brett is a well-known actor. Brenda smiled. It was obvious that she had held more affection towards Brett than she did for Clara. Ellen gave Brenda one of her better fake smiles. Do you know them? She asked casually with one raised eyebrow. Brenda gave Ellen a pleasant smile and said, they are newlyweds. They are Mr. and Mrs. Brett Masters. Her name is Monique. Mrs. Monique Masters. Brenda made a face. Albert accidentally hit his fork with his elbow out of being surprised over Clara's name change and marriage, and the fork went flying off of the table and landed on the ground. Oh dear, Albert said loudly, more over the news than over the flight of his fork. Let me get that for you, Brenda said as she bent over and picked up the fork for Albert. I will bring you a new one in a few minutes. Thank you, Albert said. Brenda nodded. Have you had enough time to look at the menus? She asked. Albert smiled and said, yes, we will both have the porterhouse steaks, please. Terrific. How would you like those cooked? Brenda asked. I would like mine medium well, Albert said. Brenda looked at Ellen. How would you like your steak? She asked. Medium well, please. Ellen gave Brenda a smile. What 2 side dishes would you like with your steak? Brenda asked Ellen. What are my choices? Ellen asked. We have mashed potatoes with our house gravy, mixed vegetables, broccoli, red scallop potatoes, green beans, a giant baked potato, or sweet yams. Oh, my. Those all sound good. I think that I will have the mashed potatoes with the house gravy, and green beans, Ellen said. Good choices. Brenda wrote down Ellen's choices and how they both wanted to have their steaks cooked, and then she looked at Albert. And for you, sir, she asked. I will have the scallop potatoes and green beans. Albert loved scallop potatoes. He could eat them daily if he wasn't cutting back slightly on his carbs. Very good, Brenda said as she picked up the menus. Would either of you like me to refresh your drinks? She asked. Albert looked at his glass. Maybe when lunch arrives. Brenda looked at Ellen. Would you like another sherry? She asked. Ellen held her hand over her glass. One is enough for me, thank you. Is there anything else that I can get for you to drink then? Brenda asked Ellen. Thank you. Perhaps a glass of iced tea. You wouldn't happen to have peach mango, would you? Ellen was in an exotic mood due to the hotel's extravagant and exotic surroundings. Episode 6. Obvious reactions. We do. Brenda finished writing down their order. Would you like me to bring the iced tea to you now? She asked. Brenda attempted to give Ellen a smile, but it seemed that she was unable to. Slight tears seemed to be forming in her eyes instead. That would be fine, thank you, Ellen said, trying not to be obvious that she noticed Brenda's emotional change. All right. I will go turn in your orders and I will be right back with a new fork for you. Brenda glanced at Albert. Would you like iced tea or anything else to drink? Thank you, Albert said. Peach mango iced tea sounds good. Brenda nodded and then walked off. She almost tripped as she walked back inside the restaurant due to looking at Clara and Brett more than where she was going. Brenda turned in Ellen's and Albert's orders inside and then, as promised, brought Albert a fresh fork, and Ellen's and Albert's iced teas to the table. "Here you go," Brenda said as she set Albert's clean fork down on his napkin and the iced teas on the table. "Your lunch should be here in about 5 minutes." "Thank you," Albert said. Brenda walked off, and once she was out of sight, Albert leaned forward and whispered to Ellen. "What is with this Monique business? You and I both know that is Clara Barnes. Well, now Clara Masters. Or rather Monique. So, she changed her name?" Albert asked, although the answer was quite obvious. It was his way of starting a deep conversation with Ellen. More than likely. It could be to disassociate herself with Scott and that whole business, Ellen said quietly. Or just to be deceptive. Albert said a little too loudly, and the young couple that had just been seated at the table next to them gave him a quick glance. Albert ignored them. "That's also a possibility," Ellen said. She glanced over at the couple, who were busy getting comfortable at the table. They didn't seem to be paying attention to her and Albert's conversation any longer. Brenda came back to the table with an embarrassed look on her face. "I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you both if you would like the house salad or the soup of the day. It comes with a meal, along with fresh French bread or rye bread." "That's nothing to worry about, dear," Ellen said. "I would love to have the house salad with ranch dressing, please. And I prefer French bread." "Perfect. And for you, sir?" Brenda asked. Her face was quite pale. "What is the soup of the day?" Albert asked. "Chicken tortilla soup," Brenda answered. Albert made a face. Chicken tortilla soup gave him indigestion. "That's a bit spicy for me." Albert patted his stomach, which was just slightly pouchy. "I will have the house salad with blue cheese dressing, please. And rye bread." "Terrific. Would you both like your salads and bread now or with lunch?" she asked. "Now would be good, thank you," Ellen said as she watched Brenda's expression. "I'll have mine now as well," Albert said. "I will be back with your salads and bread baskets in just a moment," Brenda said. She glanced over at Clara, who was now going by Monique, and at Brett. They were leaning over the table and kissing in a manner that would have been better suited to their honeymoon suite. Brenda gasped and dropped her order book. She mumbled something under her breath that neither Ellen nor Albert could understand as she bent over and picked it up. Episode 7. An interesting turn. Brenda realized that she was being rude to Ellen and Albert and quickly apologized. "I'm so sorry," she said. She leaned forward and whispered, "I don't usually tell my business to our guests, but I was engaged to Brett until that woman came along and stole him away from me with her talk of being a millionaire and that she was about to inherit a huge amount of money." Albert and Ellen stifled gasps, and Ellen said, "That's all right, dear. Your secret is safe with us. You aren't offended by my lack of professionalism?" Brenda asked as she stood up straight. "Not at all," Albert said reassuringly. "We value you as a human being along with being a server." "I'm glad that you said something to us," Ellen said. Ellen looked over at Albert, who was itching to let Brenda in on their own little secret. "That woman Monique is really a woman named Clara Barnes. We came across her when we were investigating a murder," Albert said in a low voice. Brenda gasped and put her hand to her mouth. "A murder?" she whispered tensely. "Are you investigators?" Ellen wasn't sure if she or Albert should really have said something to Brenda. She thought quickly, and then said, "If you would, dear, please keep this information to yourself." Ellen gave Brenda a comforting look and said, "We aren't formal investigators, we just dabble a little when the circumstances arise." "Tell no one," Albert added. "Not even Brett." Brenda's still pale face grew even paler. "But what if he is in danger?" "That's highly doubtful," Albert said with some authority. "It was her boyfriend that was involved in a murder, and while the police felt that Clara was innocent, we feel otherwise." "So, you think that Brett is safe?" Brenda asked while resting her order book on the table. "Not entirely, dear," Ellen said. Brenda quickly turned her head and looked at Ellen and asked, "What do you mean?" It's quite possible that Clara gets her men to do her dirty work. Ellen leaned back in her chair. The fact that you mentioned that Clara, or rather Clara as Monique, mentioned that she is going to inherit a huge amount of money, as you say, makes me wonder if she has another victim in mind. Just then the manager of the restaurant came up to the table and cleared his throat. Brenda, you have guests at other tables that need tending, as well, the 40-year-old man with dark brown curly hair and brown eyes said dryly. I'm sorry, Bert. I will be right on it. I'm just finishing up their order here. Brenda lied cleverly to try and cover her tracks while she hoped that Bert Mason had not heard any of their conversation. Bert gave Brenda a nod and then he gave Ellen and Albert a polite smile before he left. Shouldn't I warn Brett? Brenda said quickly. No. Not yet, anyway, Ellen said. Perhaps you can come to our room in the hotel tonight and meet with us and we can discuss a way to keep Brett safe and prevent another murder. And if you were to tell him, he might not believe you, Albert added. Yes, he might just think that you are having a fit of jealousy and making things up, Ellen said. He might even tell Clara what you said and scare her off. If we work this right, we may be able to stop Clara from using Brett and get her arrested in the act of soliciting him for murder, Albert said wisely. Brenda smiled and felt relieved. As scared as she felt for Brett, the thought of Monique being arrested and sent to prison and away from Brett delighted her. Episode 8. Trivial Matters. Ellen wrote down her room number on a piece of paper that was in her purse and handed it to Brenda. Shall we say 7:30? Ellen said with a polite smile. Brenda took the paper, looked at it, and then put it in her pocket. That sounds perfect. The color came back to Brenda's face as she smiled with relief. Thank you. And I promise I won't say anything to anyone, including Brett. Knowing how brainwashed he has been from that woman, he would probably run straight to her and tell her everything. And then I would never get him back. Albert held his tongue. He had qualms about any woman taking a man back who so quickly let himself be stolen away from a pretty woman with money. Brenda smiled at Albert and Ellen and said, I will see you tonight. She started to walk away and turned and looked at Ellen and Albert, and said, oh, goodness. I will see you in a few minutes as well, with your salads, bread basket, and butter. Ellen kept a smile on her face as she gave a nod of her head to Brenda. Once Brenda was out of earshot, Albert said at a low volume, she's a flighty one. Ellen looked at Albert and said, well, certainly that could be expected from anyone who has just had their fiancé swept away by a murder suspect. Albert picked up his spoon and set it back down. When you put it like that, yes, I could see why. A few moments later, Brenda brought Ellen's and Albert's salads, and a large basket of hot bread along with a dish filled with gold foil-wrapped butter. Inside the basket, there were several hot rolls, a half a loaf of hot sliced rye bread, and a half a loaf of hot sliced sourdough bread. Here you go, Brenda said with a smile as she set everything down on the table. Hugo will be bringing your meals to you in about 5 minutes or so. I'm off for the day. I am so glad that I got to serve you both, and I look forward to speaking with you tonight. Thank you, we are looking forward to talking with you tonight, as well, Ellen said. Albert was busy adding the dressing that was in a small serving pitcher to his salad and wasn't paying attention. Ellen looked at him, and then at Brenda and smiled again and said, we will see you tonight. Ellen and Albert refrained from conversation as they ate their salads and bread. As promised, the new server, Hugo, arrived with their prime rib plates. Hi, I'm Hugo, I will be your server for the rest of your meal. Here are your prime ribs and sides. Please let me know if you need anything else, Hugo said as he set their plates down on the table. Hugo was in his late 20s and had dark brown hair that was almost black, and dark brown eyes. Thank you, Ellen said. I think that I have everything that I need for now. Albert looked at his plate and the table and said, everything that we need appears to be here, thank you. Very well. I will be back in a little bit to check on you and to see if you have any room for dessert, Hugo said with a grin. Ellen smiled at Hugo and said, thank you. Albert had just placed a bite of prime rib in his mouth, so he just gave Hugo a smile. A few minutes after Hugo left, Albert looked at Ellen and asked, so, what's your plan for tonight? Plan? Ellen asked. Yes, how are we going to proceed to try to catch Clara, or rather Monique, in the act of plotting a murder? Oh, I'd say that she already has it plotted out, Ellen said firmly. Episode 9. A Day Out. Albert gave Ellen a serious look and said, "Perhaps we should contact the local police." "Perhaps we should," Ellen said as she brought her fork to her mouth. "But then again, perhaps not. They may make Clara suspicious." Ellen put her fork back down on her plate after quickly eating what was on it. "I agree," Albert said as he watched Ellen. "Let's finish our lunch, get settled in a little more, and then go to some of the local shops. We can enjoy pleasant conversation," Ellen said with a smile. "After all, this is a vacation, so we should do vacation-y things." "Vacation-y?" Albert said with an amused smile. Ellen crinkled her eyes as she smiled. "Just a fun play on words," she said jovially. "Nice," Albert said. Ellen and Albert finished their meal and paid their check. "I'd like to freshen up before we go to the shops," Ellen said as she and Albert made their way to the lobby. "Me, too," Albert said. Ellen and Albert got in the elevator and went back to their rooms for half an hour before they went downstairs and out the front door of the hotel. "Shall we take a taxi?" Ellen asked as she looked at Albert, who generally didn't enjoy walking. Albert smiled at Ellen and said, "I have a better idea. I will be right back." "Okay," Ellen said as she clasped her hands together and gave Albert a polite smile. Albert went back into the hotel and came out 5 minutes later with a set of keys. He held them up and smiled at Ellen and said, "Follow me." Ellen gave Albert a nod of her head and followed him to the right and to the end of the hotel. Albert turned right again and headed towards the valet that was working next to a dozen golf carts. Albert handed the keys to the dark-haired, brown-eyed valet. The valet, named Fred, nodded and gave Albert a smile. "I will be right back with your cart." Ellen smiled, glad that they were not going to have to walk a block or two to get to the shops or bother with Albert's car. A few moments later, the valet came back with a shiny red golf cart and parked it in front of Albert and Ellen. He left the keys in the ignition and got out of the cart. "Thank you," Albert said as he handed the valet a $5 bill. Fred was pleased with his tip from Albert and gave him a genuine smile as he took the money from him. "Thank you," Fred said with a few nods of his head. Albert smiled back and said, "You are welcome." Albert helped Ellen into the golf cart and then got in himself. Ellen had no fears about Albert's driving. She smiled and put on her seatbelt while Albert put on his. Albert drove the golf cart down the street and parked near the corner where the closest shops were. He got out of the cart and then helped Ellen out. "This was a good idea that you had, Albert," Ellen said with a smile as she walked to the first shop with him. Ellen and Albert went to 10 different shops on the same side of the street before heading across the street and looking in the shops there, as they made their way back to where they had started. When they reached the corner, Ellen and Albert crossed the street and got into the golf cart and headed back to the hotel. Episode 10. The Meeting with Brenda. When Ellen and Albert arrived back at the hotel, they turned in their golf cart. Albert gave Fred another $5 tip and then he and Ellen went to their rooms to freshen up for dinner. Once Ellen and Albert were finished freshening up, they went back to the restaurant downstairs and ordered steaks. Dinner conversation was kept to trivial matters and light-hearted subjects. After dinner, they walked the hotel grounds and enjoyed the waterfalls and the fresh evening air. Ellen finally looked at her watch and said, "It's almost 7:30. We should go upstairs in case Brenda is early." "I agree," Albert said in a somewhat serious tone. "What are we going to tell her?" "Not much," Ellen said softly as she and Albert made their way back into the hotel and to the elevator. "I will let you do the talking," Albert said. Ellen nodded. She knew how to be discreet. Precisely at 7:30 there was a knock on Ellen's door. Ellen looked at Albert and smiled and said, "That must be Brenda." Albert stood up and said, "I will get it." Albert walked over to the door and opened it. Brenda was wearing a black jacket. She seemed nervous. "Come in," Albert said politely. Brenda gave Albert a quick, shy smile and followed him into Ellen's room. Come have a seat on the couch, Albert said. Thank you, Brenda said with a shy smile. Albert led Brenda over to the couch. Can I get you something to drink? Albert asked as Brenda took her jacket off and made herself comfortable next to Ellen on the couch. Something light and lemony. Lemon soda? Brenda said with a smile. Sure. I will be right back with it. Ellen, would you like something to drink? Albert asked. I would like the same, thank you. Over ice, Ellen answered. Is there any other way? Albert said with a twinkle in his eye. Ellen gave Albert that knowing smile. It was a comfort to her for having such a good, long-time friend in Albert. He was a wonderful person. Albert went to the kitchen and fixed 3 glasses of lemon-lime soda over ice and brought them over to the coffee table and set them down on coasters. He sat down to Ellen's left and picked up his drink and sipped on it. It was his way of avoiding talking. Brenda took several sips of her soda and then looked at Ellen and said, Please don't take this the wrong way, but are you sure about Monique? Ellen cleared her throat. She understood about Brenda's denial. She took a sip of her soda and set her glass down and then smiled at Brenda. Monique is most definitely the same person as Clara, who was mixed up in a murder. I'm sorry. Maybe we should have not said anything to you. Ellen sat back on the couch and breathed easy. This was a perfect excuse to not delve into all of the details. It would be safer to keep them from Brenda. Ellen felt in her heart that Brenda could be the type to run and tell Brett everything. But let's not stress you out with the details. Just know that Albert and I are working diligently on the case privately, and that Brett may soon be yours again. Ellen had to bite her cheek to keep from making a face from her obvious sales pitch. Although, in her heart, she knew that if Clara was out of the picture, or even in prison, Brett would most likely go back to Brenda and Brenda, like most women, would eagerly accept him.